Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take a stack of compelling sources and distill them into the essential knowledge you need to cut through the noise and truly be well-informed.
That's the goal.
Today we're diving into one of the most, perplexing paradoxes in business. Why do seemingly strong, well-managed companies, the ones we admire, the ones with their competitive antenna up, listening intently to their customers, investing aggressively, why do these companies often stumble and lose their market dominance?
It's a real head-scratcher when you look back. I mean, think about Sears Roebuck. For decades, they were just the retail powerhouse, right? A model of astute management, even pioneering things like modern supply chain management.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yet they fundamentally missed the rise of discount retailing completely. Or Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, hailed as a paragon of excellence in the computer industry.
I remember that.
Yeah, one analyst back in '86 called them a moving train that IBM should watch out for. Just a few years later, they were in crisis, couldn't respond to the personal computer revolution.
So here's the twist, and this is what our sources really bring out. What if these companies didn't fail despite doing things right? But precisely because they were. What if their downfall was like a direct result of listening too closely to their best customers?
Right.
Investing in what seemed most profitable and optimizing for strategies that made perfect sense at the time. It sounds completely counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It truly is. And this is the core of what our sources are calling the innovator's dilemma. So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack this hidden challenge, this strategic innovation puzzle.
Okay.
We're going to explore the crucial distinctions between different kinds of innovation, look at how an organization's internal workings can actually become its own biggest hurdle.
Its own enemy, almost.
Yeah, exactly. And reveal how you can spot these traps before they become, existential threats.
Okay, get ready for some insights that I think will genuinely change how you think about success and failure in business. Let's dive in. All right, let's unpack this innovator's paradox. For so long, we've thought company failures stem from, the usual suspects, bureaucracy, arrogance, maybe just bad luck.
Yeah, the easy answers.
Right. But what the research suggests is far more surprising. Good management itself. That can be the most powerful reason for failure.
Yeah. You mean these companies stumbled because they were doing what we all consider good management?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's because they were listening astutely to customers, investing aggressively in the very technologies those customers actually wanted, and meticulously allocating capital to innovations that promise the best returns. It's completely counterintuitive, but that's the dilemma.
Wow.
And to really get a handle on it, we need to distinguish between two critical types of innovation: sustaining technologies and disruptive technologies.
Ooh, okay. So what's the difference then? Let's start with sustaining technologies. What are those? The sustaining technologies are basically about improving existing products, along dimensions that mainstream customers already value.
Like making things faster.
Faster, bigger, better quality, more reliable, that kind of thing. These can be small, incremental tweaks, or even, radical breakthroughs. But the key is they keep the existing product moving along its expected improvement path.
And it seems established firms, well, not surprisingly, they're excellent at this. Our sources point to the disk drive industry as a classic example. Companies like IBM, Control Data, Seagate, they led in incredibly complex and expensive sustaining innovations.
Oh, yeah.
Things like developing thin film disks and heads. We're talking like multi-million-dollar, multi-year efforts here.
Huge investments.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
Did leading in these complex, expensive innovations actually give them a lasting competitive edge? What did the research show?
Well, not really, or at least not a permanent one. The data suggests that leading in these complex sustaining innovations often doesn't provide a significant long-term competitive advantage. Yeah, followers, companies like Fujitsu or Hitachi, they often did just as well, entering later without really losing market share in the long run. It's almost like the market caught up quickly, neutralizing that early investment advantage.
Okay, so if sustaining technologies are about improving what already exists, what then are disruptive technologies? That sounds more dramatic.
It often is in its impact. Disruptive technologies offer a different set of attributes. They're typically simpler, cheaper, and initially, and this is really key, they perform worse on the metrics that mainstream customers care about.
Worse? So why would anyone want them?
Because they find their first home, their first commercialization in emerging markets, often markets that seem insignificant at first.
Okay, I'm thinking about the disk drives again.
Yeah.
That evolution from those massive 14 inches down to 8-inch, 5.25-inch, and eventually those tiny 3.5-inch ones.
Exactly.
The 5.25-inch drive, for instance, I remember reading it, was initially vastly inferior in capacity and cost per megabyte compared to the 8-inch standard used by mini computer manufacturers.
So why did it take off?
Because it found a completely different use case. It was smaller, lighter, and more economical. And that was absolutely perfect for the emerging desktop PC market.
Ah,
It wasn't about being better in the traditional mini computer sense, but better for a new, different set of needs. And here's another surprising insight from the sources. Disruptive innovations are usually technologically pretty straightforward.
really? Not cutting-edge tech.
Often not. They frequently use off-the-shelf components just put together in a simpler architecture.
Okay, so it's not about some massive technological leap, necessarily. But if these disruptive innovations are often simpler and cheaper, why do rational, well-managed companies struggle so much to adopt them? It feels like they should be eager for them. What are those core blockers that lead them astray?
Well, it comes down to what looks like really good business sense on the surface. I mean, imagine you're running a multi-billion-dollar company.
Right.
Your focus is growth, pleasing your shareholders, maintaining profitability. Why would you chase after some small, unproven market with potentially lower profit margins?
Especially when your best customers are telling you no.
Exactly. Especially when your biggest, most profitable customers are actively telling you they don't want this new, seemingly inferior thing. In fact, the research shows customers can even actively mislead their suppliers away from disruptive innovation simply by sticking to what they already value.
Wow. Okay, I mean, think about that 1.8-inch disk drive example. Major disk drive companies had prototypes, right? But they couldn't sell them to their mainstream customers, the laptop makers at the time.
Nope.
Oh. But then some small startup in Colorado, completely unknown to the big players, finds a market for them in car navigation systems. It just didn't fit the established customer base or, crucially, the revenue targets of the large firms.
That's it.
It really highlights how that old advice, stay close to your customers, isn't always robust, is it? Especially when innovation is disruptive.
Precisely. If your best customers consistently lead you towards sustaining innovations, where does that leave the disruptive ones? It leaves an opening.
So if these good management practices can actually lead companies astray, what are the underlying forces at play here? Our sources introduce this concept of value networks. What exactly is that, and how does it contribute to this whole dilemma?
Right, the value network. Think of it as the ecosystem in which a firm operates. It fundamentally defines how that company sees customer needs, how it solves problems, how it competes. And what's fascinating here is how the very metrics of what makes a product valuable change dramatically across these different networks.
Also.
We'll take disk drives again. For mainframe computers, performance meant massive capacity and blistering speed. That was value.
Okay.
But for portable computers, value meant ruggedness, low power consumption, and small size. Same basic product to disk drive, but entirely different metrics of value depending on the network.
And it's not just the metrics, is it? Each value network also demands a specific cost structure, I imagine.
Absolutely critical point. A company built for high-end mainframe components with their associated overhead and margins simply can't pivot easily to supplying low-cost portable computer parts and expect to remain profitable using the same structure.
Yeah, I can see that.
Mainframe disk drive makers, for example, needed something like 50–60% gross margins to be profitable within their network. But portable computer component suppliers, they could thrive at maybe 15–20% gross margins.
Huge difference.
Huge. And here's the trap. Companies naturally, rationally gravitate towards higher margin, larger markets within their established network. It makes sense, right? Why sell a megabyte for less when you can sell it for more to your existing high-end customers?
Of course.
But this constant upward pull creates a vacuum at the lower price points in the less demanding applications.
And that vacuum gets filled. The steel industry is a perfect case study for this, isn't it?
It really is. You had the big integrated steel mills focusing on high-quality, high-margin sheet steel for cars and appliances. They gradually, almost willingly, ceded the low-end rebar market, the stuff used in construction, to minimills like Nucor.
Why? Because it wasn't profitable enough for them.
Exactly. Nucor, with a different technology and cost structure, could operate profitably at much lower costs. Their value network was different. And once Nucor got established in rebar, what did they do? They strategically moved upmarket, disrupting the incumbents in products like structural beams and eventually even challenging them in sheet steel. It's a classic example of that vacuum being filled and then expanding upwards.
Okay, this brings us to another critical piece from the research.
Yeah.
The idea that an organization's capabilities actually define its disabilities. The RPV framework, resources, processes, and values, helps break this down.
Right.
Resources are the obvious ones: people, money, technology, brands, and you take Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC again. They certainly have the engineering talent and the cash to develop PCs. So resources weren't the problem there.
No, they had plenty of resources. But then you get to processes. These are the methods, the routines, the ways companies work to perform recurrent tasks. Things like product development, manufacturing, budgeting.
And these are designed for efficiency and consistency, right?
Exactly. Which means they inherently resist change. DEC's processes were honed for designing complex mini-computers. We're talking 2-3-year development cycles. Lots of in-house component manufacturing, direct sales teams managing big corporate accounts.
Okay.
Those processes were simply incompatible with the PC market's needs. The PC world needed 6-12-month cycles, outsourced modular components, retail sales channels. The very processes that made DEC great at mini-computers made them utterly incapable organizationally in the PC space.
Wow. Their strength became their weakness.
Precisely. And the third element is values. These aren't ethical values, but the criteria managers use for prioritization decisions. They reflect the company's cost structure and profit expectations.
So if your company's values, its financial rules, dictate a minimum 40% gross margin for any new project,
Then any project promising less, even if it's a potentially huge disruptive opportunity, will simply get killed. It won't get resources. It won't fit the model.
and DEC's values clearly prioritize those high-margin mini-computers.
Absolutely. Which made lower margin PC initiatives look fundamentally unattractive internally, no matter how big the potential market seemed from the outside. So the catch is profound. The very processes and values that make a company excel in its mainstream business often render it incapable of succeeding with disruptive innovations. They're not bad managers. They're stuck in their organizational DNA.
This also helps explain why small markets just don't excite big companies, doesn't it? I mean, the scale is just wrong.
Totally wrong. If you're a, say, $4 billion company and you need 20% growth just to keep your stock price steady.
Which is pretty standard pressure.
Right. You need to find $800 million in new revenue this year. Emerging markets for disruptive technologies, they might be $10 million, maybe $20 million in their first few years. They're just too small to move the needle for a giant corporation.
They don't register on the P&L in a meaningful way.
Exactly. Think about Apple's Newton PDA back in the day. Apple was a $5 billion company when it launched the Newton. Massive investment, CEO priority, huge fanfare.
And remember the hype.
Yeah. And despite selling 140,000 units in its first 2 years, which, by the way, was more than 3 times the sales of the original Apple II that literally made Apple a leader.
Wow, 3 times.
3 times. But the Newton was perceived internally and externally as a flop. Why? Because those 140,000 units generated sales that were only about 1% of Apple's total revenue needs at the time. It just didn't matter enough financially.
Even though it outsold the Apple IIs initially.
Right. And its expensive design, which targeted the main PDA market vision, left no room for simpler, cheaper versions that might have appealed to other emerging niche segments.
So what looks like a huge triumph for a small startup can literally be seen as a failure for a large incumbent, purely because of the scale of growth they require. That's a sobering thought.
It really is. It shows how size itself can become a disadvantage when facing disruption.
Okay, we've talked about how internal structures, processes, values can block innovation. But what about understanding the market itself? We're always told, do your market research, analyze the data. But when it comes to disruptive tech, it seems our sources suggest that very advice might actually be a trap, right?
That's exactly it. It's another one of those counterintuitive findings. For truly disruptive innovations, the market, well, it often literally doesn't exist yet.
Doesn't exist.
Not in a way you can analyze reliably. So, trying to forecast it using traditional market research methods is often a fool's errand. The forecasts for these kinds of markets are consistently wildly wrong.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure, look at HP's tiny 1.3-inch Kitty Hawk disk drive from the early 90s. HP invested heavily based on really optimistic forecasts for the handheld computer, the PDA market. They even designed specific features into it, like shock sensors, specifically for that predicted use.
Okay, sounds like they did their homework based on the forecasts.
They did. But guess what? That big PDA market didn't materialize as predicted. And HP found its highly engineered, relatively expensive little drive was just too costly for the actual emerging markets that popped up.
Like what?
Things like early Japanese word processors, cash registers, even video game cartridges. These markets valued simplicity and low cost above all else. HP's Kitty Hawk was over-engineered and overpriced for them.
So they pulled it.
Yeah, HP withdrew Kitty Hawk. Their market research, meticulously based on a non-existent or wrongly predicted market, led them completely astray.
Wow. That reminds me of the famous Honda secret you hear about. Honda's massive success in the North American motorcycle market. That wasn't due to brilliant planning or meticulous market research for dirt bikes, was it?
Not at all. It's a fantastic story. Their initial plan was to sell large highway bikes, mirroring the U.S. market leaders, and those bikes failed. They had quality issues. They didn't quite fit.
So what happened?
What happened was, almost out of desperation or just for fun, a few Honda executives started riding their small 50cc Super Cubs around Los Angeles. Just for errands,
Yeah.
And they took them off-road sometimes on trails.
Okay.
And people saw them. Sears Roebuck buyers saw them, got interested in selling them for off-road use. Suddenly, there was this unforeseen, completely unresearched market for small, cheap, reliable off-road bikes. It wasn't planned at all.
And the famous "you meet the nicest people on a Honda" campaign.
That came later. It was actually created by a UCLA advertising student as part of a class project, observing this new, unexpected phenomenon of ordinary people riding these small bikes. Honda just recognized the accidental discovery and ran with it.
So it was almost like they stumbled into success purely by accident. That's quite a departure from the image of meticulous corporate planning we usually have for these industrial giants.
Exactly. Sometimes, as the sources suggest, innovation is less about a grand strategy mapped out in a boardroom and more about seeing a happy accident and having the organizational agility to pivot and embrace it. It's almost humbling, isn't it?
It really is.
And this leads to a really fundamental principle for managing disruptive tech. Managers have to assume their initial strategies will be wrong.
Assume they're wrong.
Yes. The goal isn't perfect execution of a flawed initial plan. The goal is to learn and adapt quickly, conserving resources so you can make multiple attempts, multiple pivots. The difference between the successful disruptive ventures and the failed ones is often not the brilliance of the initial strategy, but the ability to iterate, learn, and pivot based on real market feedback.
Plans for learning, not just for execution.
Precisely. Discovery-driven planning.
Okay, another key phenomenon we need to get our heads around is performance oversupply. What happens when technology improves faster than the market can actually absorb or use those improvements?
Right. This is a really common pattern. Technology, especially in some fields, improves at a blistering pace, often faster than customers' needs evolve. So once products overshoot what mainstream customers can actually utilize on key performance dimensions, think disk drive capacity or maybe the purity of insulin,
Okay.
the basis of competition shifts. What customers value starts to change.
And how does it shift? Is there a pattern?
There's a predictable pattern. It typically moves from raw functionality or performance, then to reliability, then it shifts towards convenience and ease of use, and finally, often it comes down to price.
Okay, so back to disk drives. Once capacity was good enough for most users.
Competition shifted. First, maybe to size, smaller drives were more convenient, then perhaps reliability became crucial, and eventually, price became a major factor.
And what about accounting software? That's another example.
Perfect example. Intuit's QuickBooks didn't win by offering more features than existing sophisticated accounting packages. Those packages had already overshot what most small business owners needed or wanted.
They were too complex.
Exactly. QuickBooks won by being simpler, easier to use, more convenient for small business owners who weren't trained accountants. It met their needs better by offering less, in a way.
Less complexity, more convenience.
Right. Or think about Eli Lilly and insulin. They invested, $1 billion to create Humulin, this ultra-pure, genetically engineered human insulin. They priced it at a 25% premium.
Sounds like a breakthrough.
Technologically, it was. But the market, for the most part, was actually pretty happy with the existing, less pure, cheaper pork-derived insulin. For many diabetics, the extra purity didn't offer a noticeable benefit. Lilly had overshot the market's need for purity.
So what happened?
Meanwhile, Novo, a smaller Danish competitor, introduced insulin pens. These didn't improve the insulin itself, but they made the injection process vastly simpler and more convenient. And for that convenience, Novo gained market share and could even command a 30% price premium.
Wow. So convenience trumped purity.
In that segment, absolutely. The trap here is clear. Established companies unconsciously migrate upmarket, chasing higher performance and margins, over-satisfying their original, most profitable customers.
And leaving the door wide open at the bottom.
Exactly. They create a vacuum at lower price points, serving less demanding customers, which is the perfect entry point for disruptive entrants. It's like they're unintentionally clearing the path for their own disruption.
So, okay, we understand these systemic forces now, the value networks, the RPV framework, performance oversupply, the pitfalls of market research. How do you actually harness these principles? How do companies succeed with disruptive innovation? What's the secret sauce for navigating this dilemma?
Well, the first and maybe most crucial thing is you absolutely cannot fight these organizational laws of nature. Trying to force a disruptive innovation through mainstream processes and values that are inherently hostile to it, it just doesn't work.
You don't fight the system.
You don't fight the system head on. Success comes from understanding and aligning with the inherent forces of organizational behavior, rather than trying to overpower them. And the most consistent solution that emerges from all the research, the one that seems to work time and again, is to create independent organizations specifically for disruptive technology.
Independent. How independent are we talking? Like a separate department?
Often much more than that. If a disruptive innovation doesn't fit the mainstream organization's values, meaning its cost structure, its profit expectations, or if its initial market size is just too small to be significant to the parent company.
Which we know is often the case.
Right. Then you need to create a separate, truly independent entity, a spin-off, a new division located elsewhere, something with its own autonomy. This new organization can then forge its own cost structure, its own processes, its own sales channels, its own rules for success, completely free from the gravitational pull of the core business.
So it's not just a separate team working down the hall, it's almost like a completely different company operating under a different set of rules.
Precisely. Think back to IBM and its original PC division. Instead of trying to force PC development into their massive, bureaucratic mainframe operation in New York.
Which would have killed it.
Almost certainly. They set it up autonomously down in Florida. And this wasn't just a separate office. It was genuinely free to make its own decisions. Procuring components from outside vendors, setting up retail sales channels through Sears and Computerland, things that were unthinkable in the mainframe world. It was tailored to the emerging PC market, not the existing mainframe one.
And it worked. Spectacularly for a while.
It did. Another great example is HP with their inkjet printers. They created a completely autonomous unit way up in Vancouver specifically to develop inkjet. They consciously allowed it to compete directly with their established, highly successful, highly profitable LaserJet division based in Boise.
Letting them fight it out.
Essentially, yes. And the result? Both businesses thrived for a long time. HP dominated both the high-end laser market and the lower-end inkjet market. Even if one eventually cannibalized the other to some extent, HP owned the disruption rather than being a victim of it.
And Quantum, the disk drive maker, did something similar with their Plus Development spin-off for 3.5-inch drives, right?
Exactly. Financed by Quantum, but run independently with its own staff, facilities, mission. It successfully launched the 3.5-inch drives while Quantum's mainstream struggled with the transition. These independent units work.
And crucially, the CEO's personal involvement, their protection of the spin-off, seems vital here, doesn't it?
Absolutely critical. The CEO has to personally champion the new venture and, maybe more importantly, ensure its independence from the mainstream resource allocation processes. Without that top-level buy-in and active protection, the gravitational pull of the core business, its processes, its values, its need for big profits now, is just too strong. It will inevitably suck the disruptive project back in and smother it with the old way of doing things.
Okay, so structure is key. Create an independent space. But beyond structure, you also need a different approach to planning. You mentioned discovery-driven planning earlier.
Yes. Given everything we've heard about the unpredictability of disruptive markets.
Right, you can't forecast them accurately.
You have to embrace that uncertainty. Assume your initial forecasts and strategies are wrong. Build maximum flexibility into your plans. Invest incrementally. Stage your bets. Focus on rapid experimentation and learning. And crucially, be prepared to pivot. Maybe multiple times. Just like Honda accidentally discovered the dirt bike market, not through planning, but by executives riding their little super cubs around for fun.
Learn by doing, essentially.
Learn by doing. Learn by failing small. Learn by adapting fast. It also means reframing the challenge. Disruptive technology shouldn't be framed primarily as a technological challenge. You know, how do we improve this thing until it matches mainstream needs? It should be framed primarily as a marketing challenge. Who are the customers right now who value the product's current, perhaps initially imperfect, attributes? Where is the market for this thing as it is today? You find or create the market for what the disruptive technology is, not just what you hope it will eventually become for your existing customers.
Find the foothold market first.
Find that initial foothold, however small, where the product's unique attributes are actually valued.
Let's try and apply all of this to a really current and massive example, electric vehicles. How do our sources classify the electric car? And what does the innovator's dilemma suggest about its likely path and who might win?
Okay, yeah. EVs are a fascinating case study through this lens. The sources clearly classify the electric car as a disruptive technology relative to the traditional gasoline automobile.
Why disruptive? The performance is getting pretty good now.
Yes, but look at the pattern. Its performance trajectory range, charging speed, etc. is improving rapidly, probably faster than mainstream buyers actually require day to day, even though it initially underperformed gasoline cars on traditional metrics like range, refueling time, and upfront cost. And it offers different attributes: quietness, home refueling, instant torque, potentially lower running costs.
Okay, so it fits the disruptive pattern. What does that mean for automakers?
It means the established automakers shouldn't primarily try to sell EVs head-to-head into the mainstream family car market, competing directly on the old metrics. Think of Chrysler's early electric minivan attempt. It was inevitably seen as too expensive and underpowered compared to the gasoline version. That's the classic mistake.
So where should they be aiming, according to this theory?
The theory suggests the initial market for EVs is fundamentally unknowable through traditional research. You can't just survey current car buyers about a product they haven't experienced in a context that doesn't exist yet.
So companies need to. What?
Experiment.
Exactly. They must create the market through expeditions, through launching simpler, perhaps less ambitious products into niche applications to see what sticks. Learn by doing. The winning initial designs will likely be simple and convenient for a specific niche, not necessarily high-performance supercars trying to beat gasoline cars at their own game. And they'll probably find new distribution or usage models, too.
And what about the big technological hurdles like batteries? Where will those breakthroughs come from?
This is where it gets really provocative. The theory suggests that major battery breakthroughs, the sustaining innovations needed to make EVs truly mainstream, are more likely to come from or be driven by the disruptive innovators who first find a viable market for the current battery technology.
Not the big established players?
Not necessarily. The companies that find a market, even a small one, for today's EVs will have the cash flow and the customer feedback loop to then fund and direct the sustaining research needed to improve battery performance for their customers. The established players trying to force immature battery tech into existing, demanding car models might struggle to justify the continued R&D if those initial products fail commercially. It's a completely flipped perspective on where innovation comes from.
Find the market first, then drive the technology.
Find the disruptive foothold, then pull the sustaining innovations along.
So wrapping this up, the bottom line really is, the innovator's dilemma is real. It's powerful. The very management practices listening to customers, investing for profit, focusing on the core that make companies excellent leaders in their established markets can, ironically, blind them to the opportunities and the threats of disruptive technologies.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to understand it's not typically about incompetence or laziness or arrogance on the part of the managers in these established firms. It's about rational decisions trapped within systemic forces, the value network, the processes, the values inside otherwise well-managed organizations.
But understanding this gives you power. By understanding the dynamics sustaining versus disruptive innovation, the powerful pull of value networks, the inherent capabilities and disabilities baked into organizations via resources, processes, and values, you can actually make incredibly informed choices.
Yeah, you can start to see when it makes sense to double down on improving your existing business and when you absolutely need to spin out a new venture to tackle a disruption, when to listen closely to your best customers and when, paradoxically, you might need to ignore them, or at least find new customers whose problems your disruptive idea solves.
This isn't just about corporate survival, is it?
Yeah.
Right? It feels like it's about leading the next waves of change. So, a final thought for everyone listening. Thinking about your own business, maybe even your own career, what established best practices or assumptions might actually be holding you back right now? Holding you back from recognizing or maybe even embracing the next potential disruption in your field? How can you cultivate a mindset and maybe even advocate for organizational structures that allow for both ruthless efficiency in the core business and agile, sometimes messy experimentation out on the new, uncertain frontiers? That's the challenge.
A challenge worth tackling.
This has been The Deep Dive.